So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those common memory myths and hopefully bust them as a group. We're going to get started. We'll talk about some of those brain myths. All right, guys. So as we mentioned, today we're going to be talking about brain myths and hopefully busting some of them. And we're going to talk specifically about some common myths about memory. So as Victoria said, I'm a clinical neuropsychologist here at Emory. I work in our brain health center, and I'm also at the cognitive empowerment program. So if anyone has been through the program, you know me from cognitive training, and I love memory. I love talking about memory, and I love busting brain myths about memory. So before we jump into today, I want you to test your own knowledge a little bit. So we'll talk through these today, but I want you to kind of think to yourself whether the following statements are true or false. Are they fact or are they myth? So the first statement, under good conditions, so when everything's kind of going right, our memory perfectly captures the world around us. Do you think that that is a fact or a myth? The second one, using strategies like writing things down actually weakens our memories because we're not relying on that internal memory system. Do you think that is a fact or a myth? And then the last one I have for you today, in Alzheimer's disease, all types of memory are impaired. Do you think that's a fact or a myth? And again, you don't need to type this into the chat or anything like that, but I want you to kind of think to yourself, are these facts or myths? Because we're going to go through them. All right. So let's hop into the first one here. So we've got a strong opinion in the chat, all myth. All right, let's see. So the first one here, our memory perfectly captures the world around us. This is a myth. And we'll talk about why that is. So I want everyone to kind of take a moment and consider. So there are these kind of major cultural events that happen where a lot of us have similar types of memories. So I want you to consider where you were when you heard about something like the 9/11 attacks or the Kennedy assassination. I'm guessing many of us have a very kind of clear picture of where we were when we heard that, or you can think about what you were doing, maybe the first time you saw it on television. And I want you to think about how accurate that memory is. Are there pieces of it that feel really fuzzy for you, or does it feel very clear? And as you're thinking about this, my guess is for a lot of people, it feels incredibly clear. It feels like you can see it like it was yesterday. You know exactly where you were, exactly what you were doing. Now I'm going to ask you to think of a trickier memory. What did you do to celebrate your last birthday? So consider, what did you do to celebrate your last birthday? Does this feel like a clearer memory or a fuzzier memory? Now, for most of us, that memory of what we did a year ago is actually going to feel quite a bit fuzzier than what we did in, than these kind of what we call a flashbulb memory. So these major events that have happened. And the reason for that is when something really important is happening around us, really, important to the world, things like that, we create what's called a flashbulb memory. And we feel like those are really accurate. It feels like we're watching a video of ourselves going through that situation. And when these happen at a cultural level, we all kind of have these flashbulb memories. Now, when it comes to something like celebrating your birthday, that doesn't kind of create that strong flashbulb memory that we might get from something like the Kennedy assassination. And so it's really important to kind of keep in mind that even on this kind of smaller scale, we can get a difference in terms of how fuzzy a memory is, even if it's more recent, even if it's something that's really important to us. And the reason that I bring this up is because the truth is that both of those memories are subject to bias. So even when it feels like we have this perfect recollection of what happened, there are biases involved in that. Now, we know that our memories are imperfect. So research has shown time and time again that even under perfect conditions, even if it's something that's really, really important to us, our memories can be fallible and they're subject to bias. Now, this isn't a bad thing. This is completely normal. So I don't want people to walk away thinking that their memories can't be trusted or anything like that. More of what it is that we tend to really identify with certain parts of our memories that become really important. So for example, what you pay attention to and what the person next to you pays attention to, what's important to you may be very different. So even if you experience the same thing, you might have slightly different memories of it. Now, again, this is totally normal, and it's actually a product of how our brains work. So our brains are always trying to conserve energy, and what our brains do is we kind of naturally use shortcuts, right? Anytime that we are going to remember something, that's a really energy intensive process. So we want to take shortcuts wherever we can. And again, the truth is that our memories are always going to reflect the environment around us. So the truth of the situation, kind of what was actually going on, as well as personal factors. So we have agency in what we remember. And what we remember heavily depends on what we've actually paid attention to, which I'm going to show you an example of here. And if people have seen this before, I apologize, but I think it's a really good example of how important your attention is for what you remember. And if you have seen this, please don't spoil it in the chat for other people. All right, so it's going to ask you to count how many passes are made by the people in white. Actually, keep count of that number. See if you can get it right.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count?
Does anyone want to put their pass count in the chat before we reveal the answer? All right, I'm seeing some 16s, some 13s, some 10s. Fantastic. These are all great answers. Let's see here.
The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
So we're going to watch it again. This time, look for the gorilla.
This video is...
So this is a sort of classic example of how attention is critical for our memory. So we watched the same video both times, but depending on what we were paying attention to, we were actually only able to sort of remember certain pieces of it, right? So, for example, in this case, we didn't even see the gorilla. Some of us didn't even see the gorilla because we were counting the number of passes of the people in white. And for anyone that feels fooled by that, I promise you, they've done this in tons and tons of studies. Nobody sees the gorilla the first time they see that video. So don't feel too discouraged. Now, what's important about memory for this is that attention is really key to our memory. So if we're not paying attention to something, it's not even kind of on the table for us to remember. And when we think about the stages of forming a memory, the very first stage is paying attention. So you can imagine that even in your daily life, if there's a piece of what's going on that you're paying attention to, but you're not paying attention to another piece, you may actually remember that in a completely different way than the person next to you, because you simply weren't paying attention to different pieces of what was going on. So the last thing I'll talk about with this is the idea of memory biases. So our memories are subject to many different types of bias, which affect how accurate our recollection is. And these are kind of those mental shortcuts. So our brain kind of inserts these biases because they're faster. It's easier for us to kind of use those biases than to, be able to recreate perfectly every single piece of a situation. And so what we know about our memory is that we have something called a primacy and recency effect. So that means that we tend to remember the first thing presented to us and the last thing presented to us, and we tend to forget stuff in the middle. Now, this is really important for things like conversations, right? If you have something really important that you want to get across to somebody, or that something really important that you want to remember, having that be the first thing that's said or the last thing that's said automatically makes it more likely that you're going to remember it. We also know that memories are subject to something called retrospection bias, which just means that we tend to remember the past in a more favorable light than the present. So we tend to look back kind of nostalgically at our past. And this is, everyone does this. So it's important to keep that in mind as we're thinking about memories. The last thing that we do is something called confirmation bias. And this tends to look for this. So this means that we tend to look for, interpret, and remember information that aligns with our own beliefs and hypotheses. Now, again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can certainly impact how we remember a situation, because we're looking for those things that fit with kind of how we think about the world, or what our hypotheses are in a certain situation. So all of these things, again, are totally parts of our memory, but they do create sort of a discrepancy between, what we could have remembered from the world around us and what we do remember. And I'll also say that these things are really important when we think about kind of how protective we can be of our memories, right? So it's really, we kind of create those memories through unconscious processes, and those become really important to us. So it's not always actually important to line up, what is true and what is false. What's important is what we've taken from that situation. All right, next one. Using strategies like writing things down can weaken our memory. Now, I'll tell you, this isn't one that I used to include, but I've heard it multiple times through some of our programming. So I now like to kind of address it when I get the opportunity. This is also a myth. So what we know is that using strategies, doing things like writing it down, can actually really help our memories. And let me tell you why. So it makes sense that people might think if we're writing things down that could actually weaken our memory. The idea being that, if you're writing it down, maybe you don't have to rely quite as much on your memory. You're relying on that external record or something like that. But what's actually happening is when we go to write things down, it forces us to slow down and actually results in better encoding of the information. So we've slowed down, we're being more intentional. And in terms of forming a memory, that's actually one of the best things we can do. So when we write things down, we more intentionally process information. So there's actually evidence that it strengthens your memory to write things down, because you're working with that information in a really intentional way. It also creates a record for you to rely on later. So even if you don't have as strong of a memory of something, you have something to refer back to. Now, at CEP, we always recommend writing things down, especially if you want to remember it. And, when we think about forming a good memory, one of the things we really sort of emphasize is being intentional. So when we go to write down information, we're engaging in all three of these processes. We're repeating the information. We might be summarizing it, right? We often take notes and don't write down every piece of a conversation, for example, but we write down the important stuff. It's a version of summarizing, which helps us encode information. And then we also create a record. So again, we can refer back to it, right? And again, the idea here is that when we write things down, we're working with that information, we're being more intentional, and we're actually creating a better memory by doing that. All right, number 3, our last myth to be busted. In Alzheimer's disease, all types of memory are impaired. Now, this, as some of you from the very get-go were aware of, is also a myth. And the idea here is that not all types of memory are impaired in Alzheimer's disease. So when we think about things like Alzheimer's disease, we're often thinking about memory impairments, right? But when it comes to our memory, there are many different types of memory, and you can see kind of a map of that here. So when it comes to human memory, we have sensory memories, which are really quick, kind of if you were to go turn off a flash or turn off a light switch and close your eyes, you have kind of a memory of what that looked like. That's a sensory memory. They don't last very long until they get incorporated into our short-term memory. So we have sensory memory, we have short-term memory, which is also sometimes called working memory. And this is memory for what's happened in the last 90 seconds or so. And then we have long-term memory. So when we're talking about memory, most of the time we're talking about long-term memory. And when we think about what that means, most of the time we're talking about explicit and declarative memory. Now, you don't need to know these terms. The important thing to know is that that is our memory for facts, for things that have happened to us, for our experiences. We call that our declarative memory. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, that's one of the areas that we start to notice weaknesses. What's really cool, though, is we actually have this entire other memory system that's called implicit or unconscious memory and includes procedural memory. So things like our memory for skills and for tasks. So what we're going to talk a little bit about today is our implicit memory or our procedural memory, which again is that memory for skills and tasks. So we actually see that despite a decline in declarative memory for those facts or events that we see in Alzheimer's disease, procedural memory can remain relatively preserved. And activities that rely on procedural memory, like playing an instrument or knitting, if learned before the onset of impairment, can actually remain unimpaired. And I have some really cool videos here that I like to show for this. But the idea here is that not all types of memory are actually impaired in Alzheimer's disease. So let me show you this. This is one example of intact procedural memory.
Get your tissues ready for this one. Music is proving to show incredible responses in Alzheimer's patients.
Yeah, take a look at this. It's the moment a former prima ballerina was transformed when she heard music from Swan Lake. That's Marta Gonzalez. She was a prima ballerina in New York for the New York Ballet back in the 1960s. Now, this powerful moment was shared by a Spanish charity, which uses meaningful music from the lives of dementia patients to improve their mood and memory.
Wow, I could watch this all morning long. Just a graceful lady. Sadly, Marta passed away last year, but it really is a blessing that they were able to shoot this video and share it. She will definitely live on through her performance here, really giving inspiration.
And so the things to kind of take away from that, right? Even when we're not able to say necessarily. So for example, some of the really interesting kind of studies that have been done with this, people may say, I don't know how to dance, or I don't know how to play the piano. And in fact, when you present them with that, they're able to do those things. So really, really cool intact procedural memory, even when we can't say how we learned it, or how that came about, just knowing how to do those things because it's so ingrained in our procedural memory system. I have another quick example here of someone that it looks like it's unavailable, but I'll just tell you what it was. So it was this woman that it was able to play a really complicated concerto on the piano. And I like to show this one because she starts off by saying, I can't do that. I've never played the piano. And then when she goes to play it, it's beautiful. She's able to do all of those keystrokes. She knows exactly what she's doing in terms of where to put her fingers and what to play. And it's truly beautiful. And so, the important thing to keep in mind when it comes to memory is that even though pieces of our memory become weaker in Alzheimer's disease, that's not all of our memory. And so something that we work on a lot on in terms of, the research we do at CEP and really as a field is how we can use things like your procedural memory to overcome those difficulties in declarative memory. And so, in terms of our memory myths for today, we've busted 3 of them. So what we know is that even under good conditions, our memory does not perfectly capture the world around us. We can use strategies like writing things down to support our memories without weakening them. And even in Alzheimer's disease, not all types of memory are impaired. We still have some really wonderful preserved pieces. And so thank you guys for your attention. I'm happy to take questions as long as there's time before Mark gets started.
Yeah.
Thank you, Casey. We were watching some of the videos here at in the office with Victoria And some of those have been really cycling around the internet too. So maybe you've seen some of
Oh,
them.
great.
We've got a lot of thank yous coming into the chat. There's one question. Could you please show the screen that starts with the optimize attention again, if you have a chance?
Let me see. Optimize attention. Oh, this. Is this what we're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so this is actually the model that we teach in CEP for how to form a good memory. So that always starts with optimizing our attention because that's really important. And then being intentional. So repeating information, summarizing it, and creating some kind of external record.
And then we have a question coming in from the Q&A. Do you believe that we remember everything that happened to us during our lifetime, but some things are just harder to retrieve if you don't pay attention? Can you talk to us a little bit about long-term memory and memory over a lifetime?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Hold on, let me stop sharing my screen. So that's a really good question. Now, so the way that I understand it is that, we may remember things from throughout our life, but they're always subject to biases, right? So if we weren't paying attention to, so for example, there's not like a video camera in our head that's getting everything. And if only we could tap into it in a certain way, we would remember it. The memories that we form are based on our perception. They're based on our bias. They're based on what we have actively kind of seen in the world. Now, I think a second part of your question, and it may not be exactly what you were talking about, but I think it's important to talk about, is there's actually some question in the field as to whether all of our memories that we've kind of encoded are there and we just can't access them, or if we start to actually kind of delete memories that we're not using. So for example, there are certainly things that happened when I was a kid that I, at the time could have remembered. When I was 10, I could have remembered and just haven't thought about and wouldn't even think to think about now. And there's some question in the field as to whether those memories really hang around. And if we could kind of think about it the right way, we could get back to them. Or if our brain at some point says, you know what, this memory is not helpful, I'm not going to keep it. But either way, there's not kind of this perfect recording of our entire life that even we, didn't weigh in on. Any of the memories that we have are subject to those biases and are based on our own perception.
Thank you, Tracy. I know those are big questions, but it's nice to have some background on some of those. And we have another question coming in. Loved the demonstration on passing the ball. How does this affect distracted driving?
Interesting. So that is a demonstration of something called selective attention. Now, the idea with selective attention, I like to kind of think of it like a flashlight, right? Wherever we're shining our flashlight, in the case of that video, most of us were shining our flashlight on the players that were dressed in white. Those are the things that we're really paying attention to. And if there are things happening outside of that flashlight, they're probably not going to kind of make it into our consciousness. Now you can imagine when you're driving, right? What that means is that there are certain things that your flashlight is hitting and certain things that it's not. Now, most of us, as this is part of why you learn to drive, you learn what to selectively attend to. Now, so what can sometimes happen in MCI, or even just as we get older, it can be harder to kind of weigh out those distractions, right? It can be harder to kind of keep your flashlight focused on the right thing. And so when it comes to elevated distraction, or especially distracted driving, what usually we see is when you're in an environment that has a lot of stimuli, like when you're driving, that those distractors are kind of always present. And what's actually happening is your ability to filter them out is getting harder. So my guess is actually that if someone was really, really distracted on road, if that was something you were having a lot of trouble with, they may actually have noticed the gorilla in that video because they would have had a harder time really focusing in on the people that were wearing white. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, those are so helpful, Casey. Thank you so much for shedding light on some of these myths, especially the ones that are common myths that were surprising along the way.